Now we'll do some work on this hill in the middle here. So we'll go to the hill mid layer. We'll create a new layer and move it underneath. And we will call this hill mid details. And this will be some little boulders or trees or just things that are up on the top edge of this. And for that, we will use the square chalk brush. We'll use these paper settings here. We will sample the brown color and shift it just a little bit darker and shift it towards indigo. And you'll kind of want to paint with the edge of the brush to just put in some very, very distant little things. Who knows what these are? They could be rocks or trees or people, houses, who knows? I guess they don't look like houses or people, but yeah, they're probably rocks or trees. But if you wanted to put houses and people up there, you could too. Something like that. You want it to be very tiny though, and not very distinct. Let's return to the hill mid layer. Let's turn on preserve transparency. And we'll use the same square chalk brush, just a little bit bigger, to paint in some lighter brown highlights that are facing towards the light source. And in general, our light's kind of coming from here in the center. So I'm going to sample this brown color that I have for the base color, and I'm going to shift it a little bit lighter. And I'm going to increase the paper texture and scale a little bit. It always helps to give a nice rocky texture. And I'm just putting in a little bit of definition here, kind of like you would when you're doing a mountain. We'll go a little bit lighter, add some more highlights in a couple spots. You can play around with these different paper textures to get different results for the rock too. It's always good to vary them. Let's play around with that a little bit. Let's use the polypaint wool. That works really good for rock and stone. We'll have to turn the scale and texture up a little bit. And let's add some more texture by doing a select layer content selection of the hill mid layer. We'll create a new layer and we will call it hill texture. And we will turn off preserve transparency. We'll make the composite method multiply, and we'll hide the selection using show hide marquee. And we will use the sponge with a dark brown color to paint over this. Now your paper texture can sometimes affect your sponge, so you may have to turn these settings down, otherwise you're not going to get much sponge action going on. We want something like that. And if you do it too dark, you can always reduce the layer opacity to find a nice blend, something that's more subtle. Like that looks a little bit better. Let's add another layer below the texture, and we will call this hill paint. And let's try using this break thick nozzle for the distant hills. So we'll use the paint break brush, and we'll want to sample one of the lighter colors and make it a little bit lighter than that. Let's try putting in some of that. We have to remember to select the secondary color. Probably going to forget that several times in this course, and I'm sure you will too, because it's a little tricky. So always remember when you're painting with the image hose brushes, you want to use the secondary color. When you're painting with just about anything else, you want to use the main color, and you always have to switch back and forth between these. So we're on our secondary color, and we can go ahead and paint. I'm using kind of light, quick strokes to put in some texture. And we can try some different colors here. You want it to kind of break, so you want to use short little strokes, but that really helps it look like different kinds of stone. And then you can, of course, reduce the opacity to blend it in a little bit more naturally, so it's more subtle. Let's create a new layer, and we'll move it on top of the hill texture. We'll call it hill mist, and we want this to be a slightly lighter color. We'll have to switch to our main color here and pick a nice tan, and we will use the digital airbrush to paint just a little bit of mist to separate this from the foreground land, something like that. And then we'll create yet another layer. We'll call it hill tint. And just to make sure that this is set into the background enough, we will sample this blue color from the sky. We'll set the composite method to multiply, and we will paint over it lightly to tint it slightly blue, and then reduce the opacity. And what that's going to do is that's going to give it a slight blue tint, and that'll just make it blend into the background more naturally. Now, we did use a lot of layers just for this one little thing, but you'll see, since this is a non-linear way of painting, if you wanted to make adjustments to the mist and make that lighter or darker, you can. It's a way of fine-tuning, and being able to play with this opacity slider helps a lot, because you can just paint and sometimes overpaint, and then you can reduce it a little bit. So I do that a lot. Now let's clean things up a little bit since we have so many layers. Let's select the hill tint layer and hold shift and select the hill mid details layer, and we'll group these. We'll call it hill mid. Let's select the land text layer and the land foreground layer. We'll group those. We'll call it land front. We'll select the horizon and the hills too. We'll group those. We'll call it land back. And we'll group the two sky layers and we'll call it sky. Now we have a nice organized list here, and when we want to go to particular areas to work on them, we can just open this group and go in and change all the areas. So let's save this also while we're at it. I'm going to go ahead and just save a copy doing save as. I'm going to call it -2. It's okay if you get this message, you can just click yes. That just means that your selection's still active. And if we do show marquee, you can see, yep, it's still there. So we want to deselect with Control D. Now let's add some shrubs to the composition. So we'll go to the land front group. We'll add a layer above that, and we'll call it Shrubs. And we will use the Shrubs image hose nozzle for this. It's located right here in the nature group. And this works best if you just click with the mouse rather than try to draw with the pen. We shall use the linear size P brush, and the size of your brush determines the general size of the shrubs. So we want these to be probably about this big starting out. So I'm just going to use my mouse and click. You want the foreground shrubs to be generally bigger, but they can all kind of be a variety of sizes. You want some to be kind of up on the edge of the horizon there. And just kind of click. You can make some really big ones. You don't want to go too big with these because they're not going to look natural. I think something like that will work. And then at this point, they're way too bright to fit into the composition, so we'll need to tint and shade them a little bit to make them fit into the lighting. So what we'll do is we'll go to Effects, Tonal Control, and Adjust Colors. And you can do this for any of these objects when you paint them in to help them fit into your composition better. You want to change the value first to make them darker, since this is kind of a night scene. And you'll want to remove a little bit of saturation for night scenes because you don't want them to be as bright. If you needed to shift the hue, you could do that too if something is not quite the right hue overall. Like for instance, if you were using some of these grass nozzles, you could shift the hue towards a more lime green or a more grass green if you wanted to. So we'll go to OK, and that applies that change. If you want to make less uniform adjustments to the shrubs, what you do is you do a select layer content of the shrubs, hide the selection, create a new layer as you would for anything else that you want to tint. We'll call it Shrubs Tint, and we'll make it a multiply composite method. And then you can use a dark blue and the airbrush to give these some more shading. So we can make the ones that are kind of on the edges a little bit darker overall. Now they're not all the same value. We can give them a shadow that's kind of more on one side than the other. And that'll really help it look like there's kind of a primary light source maybe off to the left a little bit, which is what we're going to have in this composition. Let's deselect the selection doing Control D, and let's add another layer beneath the shrubs. We'll call it Shrubs Shadow. We'll make it a multiply composite method, and these will be the cast shadows that are coming off of the shrubs. I'll use a different color so that you can see the shape we're trying to make here. I'm kind of trying to draw a little bit of a wedge shape that comes off of these, so it looks like there's a shadow being cast, something kind of like that. Of course, you want it to be filled in with black or a dark blue. So I'm going to get that dark blue back. I'm just doing a couple strokes, a couple horizontal strokes, just kind of come off of these. Use a smaller brush for the smaller ones. Fill in this area pretty good here, because there's 3 bushes that are together. That would create a pretty big shadow. And there you go. Now these look like they fit in to the landscape much better. Let's go ahead and group them since we have this nice grouping going on here. Now at this point, if you want, you can add additional objects to your composition. You can go through this list here and find more of these objects and throw them in. If they don't fit in initially to the lighting or the environment color, now you know how to lighten and darken and tint them to make them fit in. You'll also want to make sure that you match the value structure. So if it's in the distance, you're going to want it to be lighter in value, and if it's in the foreground, you want it to be darker in value. Let's add some clay that kind of sticks up out of this dirt here. So we will go to the land front group and open it, and we will go to the land foreground layer. We want to make sure that our tinting is covering any of the dirt that we add so that we don't have to repaint our shadows. We'll call this clay, and we will use the break thick nozzle, and we'll pick a secondary color. I think we'll use this gray shifted kind of towards, we'll keep it shifted towards brown here, something like this. And we'll use the paint break image hose brush, and we'll want to make a selection of the land foreground layer first so that we don't paint outside of it accidentally. We'll hide the selection, go back to the clay, and then now if we paint, we'll just end up painting here on our dirt. I think maybe we'll go a little bit darker with this. Yeah, something like that looks good. So kind of paint in here wherever you think you want it. You can have some clay that goes in between your shrubs. This is kind of optional. You don't have to put this in, but it gives you an idea of how you can keep adding to this composition in layers. Some that goes up here. He comes out in the foreground. We'll patch there. All right, and then if we want this to look elevated, what we can do is we can add a layer underneath it. Call it clay shadow. Make it a multiply composite method. We'll pick a dark blue-gray color. We'll have to switch to our primary color again. Pick a dark blue-gray. We'll use the digital airbrush, and you want to paint right in between the brown dirt and the clay, on the right side of the clay and on the left side of the brown dirt. So you give it kind of a shadow effect here. You can also do the underside of it. Kind of depends on where your perspective is too. As your perspective starts to change here, you wouldn't really see as much of the shadow from this angle. So something like that looks good, and then you can reduce the opacity to make it a more subtle blend. And now it looks like this clay is kind of erupting up out of the earth, and it's giving kind of a slope that's casting a shadow. You could also turn down the opacity of the clay layer if you want to kind of blend it in. And if you find that you want to change the color of it and make it a little more reddish, you can do that. You can go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors. You can always adjust colors using this. So let's turn the saturation up, and you can see as I turn the saturation up, it turns this clay into a brighter red. We'll go with that and we'll click OK, and that looks much better. It's being able to make these fine adjustments that is really important to getting a nice realistic looking painting. Let's add one more object to the composition. So we still have a selection active from our dirt, so we'll just do Control D to deselect that. We'll create a new layer and we will move it below the hill mid group. We'll call it tree. This will be a silhouetted tree. We'll pick a dark blue for our secondary color here. So click on your secondary color first and then pick the dark blue. And then we will want to use the paint break brush with the leaf dabs nozzle found in the painterly category. And when you paint with it, you should get something like this. What we're going to want to do is just do a few short strokes that kind of emanate from a center point. What that's going to do is that's going to make it look like a bush shape. So if I exaggerate what I'm doing almost kind of like a tree motion here where all of my strokes are emanating from that one point there. And if it ends up being too light, you can turn on preserve transparency, and then you can just go ahead and darken it using almost black. You'll have to select your primary color. I mentioned I would forget that, and I did it there again. We'll paint with black along the side to make it much darker on the right side. Now it fits in much better. It's also fun to move these layers around. You can move groups. You'll want to close the group first. We probably don't want to move any of these land groups, but if you wanted to move the tree, you could use the layer adjuster and move the tree if there was a better place in the composition for it. Maybe I'd rather have it right about there. Okay, so now we're ready to do the fun part, which is the stars in the sky.